Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the grand halls of medieval France. The air is cool heavy with the scent of burning incense and beeswax candles. Outside, the cobbled streets hum with the distant echoes of merchant calls and the soft clatter of horseshoes on stone. But here within these towering palace walls, the world is quiet, almost too quiet. It is the year 1392, and at the very heart of this stillness sits a man who wears a crown, heavy golden, a symbol of divine authority. But beneath that crown, something fragile stirs. His name is King Charles VI of France, a ruler born into privilege, destined for greatness, yet burdened by a mind that would soon slip quietly and irreversibly into a world of strange illusions. From the outside, he looked every bit the monarch. Tall, regal, with sharp features, softened only by the faint trace of worry lines etched into his forehead far too early. Courtiers bowed low as he passed their eyes, carefully trained downward, for none dared meet the uncertain gaze of a king, teetering on the precipice of his own reality. You see, this was a man who believed, truly believed, that his body was made entirely of glass. Yes, glass. Fragile, cold, and terrifyingly brittle. At first it was whispered among the servants, dismissed as little more than courtly gossip. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into long, agonizing years, the whispers grew into terrified murmurs. His Majesty will not rise today, a maid would whisper. He fears he might shatter. And indeed, on some days, Charles refused to move at all, terrified that the smallest stumble, the faintest touch, might cause his delicate form to fracture into 1,000 irreparable pieces. How does a king, a man raised to command armies and broker peace, come to believe such a thing? How does one of the most powerful men in the world grow so consumed by fear that he wraps himself in thick layers of padded clothing, convinced this is the only barrier between himself and total destruction? To understand this, we must first step back into his childhood. Charles was crowned at just 11 years old, a boy forced to grow into his crown before his mind had the chance to mature. Surrounded by scheming uncles, political unrest, and the ever-looming specter of war, his mind became a fragile sanctuary against the chaos of his world. As the 100 Years' War raged on, the young king found himself trapped between the weight of his royal duties and the terrifying reality of his own fragile psyche. The human mind is a strange and wondrous thing, capable of both incredible resilience and profound vulnerability. And for Charles, the line between reality and delusion began to blur early. Stress, trauma, and the overwhelming burdens of leadership coalesced into a storm of confusion. At first, the signs were subtle periods of withdrawal, a vacant stare, a strange reluctance to stand too close to sharp corners or stone walls. But soon the episodes became more severe, and one fateful day during a royal procession, the unthinkable happened. Charles, dressed in full regalia, suddenly froze. His hands trembled. His eyes darted around the courtyard with wild, panicked confusion. "Careful," he cried, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Stay back. I am made of glass. One wrong move, and you shall break me." The royal guards stood dumbfounded, unsure whether to laugh or fall to their knees in despair. For how does one protect a king who believes he must be shielded, not from assassins, but from the very air itself? In the months that followed, his behavior only grew more peculiar. He ordered the palace floors to be covered in thick rugs. His chambers were lined with pillows along every hard surface. His royal garments were padded with soft fabrics to prevent even the gentlest bump from causing him imagined harm. And though his advisors begged him to see reason, Charles lived each day under the paralyzing conviction that his body, like the finest Venetian glass, was at constant risk of shattering into dust. Historians would later call this condition the glass delusion, a rare and curious mental illness that seemed to plague the elite of Europe in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. But in Charles's time, there was no such comforting label, no medical explanation to soften the tragedy. To his people, he was simply the Mad King, a monarch lost to his own imagination. Yet even in his madness, there was something heartbreakingly human about his fear. Who among us has not felt fragile at some point? Who hasn't feared that one more hardship, one more failure might finally break us beyond repair? As night falls over the palace and the flickering candlelight dances across the stone walls, you can almost hear his whispered pleas through the corridors of time. Careful, he murmurs from beneath his many layers of padded robes. Please, be careful. I am not like you. I might break. And with that image in your mind, dear listener, we begin this long, strange journey into the mind of a king, one who ruled a kingdom but lost his own sense of reality. Tonight, we will walk quietly through the forgotten halls of history, past the velvet-draped windows and over the thick carpets of a court that tried in vain to protect its most fragile sovereign. So take a deep breath. Let the world outside fall away, and join me as we follow the delicate footsteps of a king who lived his life in constant fear of falling apart. If you want to understand the madness that took hold of King Charles X, you must first step back into the soft-shadowed years of his childhood, a time when the crown was still too large for his head, and the echoes of responsibility sounded far too loud in the quiet chambers where a young boy should have found peace. Born on December 3, 1368, in the opulent halls of the Hotel Saint-Paul in Paris, Charles entered a world already weighed down by expectation. His father, King Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, had spent his reign carefully rebuilding a fractured France. But the kingdom was still a fragile thing, its foundations cracked by the ongoing 100 Years' War with England and the persistent threat of internal rebellion. Into this uneasy kingdom came a boy who was never given the chance to be just a child. Even before his small feet could confidently carry him down the palace corridors, Charles was called the Beloved. His birth was seen as a symbol of hope, a delicate thread upon which the future of the Valois dynasty rested. And with hope came pressure, a silent and invisible weight that settled upon his shoulders from the very moment he drew his first breath. The world of royal children was not a place of warmth and gentle guidance. It was a world of strict tutors, cold stone chambers, and lessons delivered with the heavy hand of duty. While other children played in sun-dappled gardens, Charles studied treaties and family bloodlines. He learned early that every word he spoke, every gesture he made, would be watched, recorded, and judged. And there was something else, a darkness, that hovered always at the edges of his young mind. You see, mental instability ran like a shadow through the branches of his family tree. His maternal grandfather, Peter of Bourbon, had suffered bouts of delusion and melancholy so deep that he had once believed himself turned into a wild beast. Madness was a quiet inheritance passed down, not with jewels or gold, but through the unseen corridors of the mind. As Charles grew older, the kingdom around him seemed to reflect his growing unease. France was a land of contradictions, lavish wealth perched uneasily atop a crumbling economy. The Black Death still haunted recent memory, its ghost lingering in empty fields and abandoned villages. And though his father, Charles the Feuillant, ruled wisely, he was a man constantly battling his own ill health and the ever-present specter of death. At just 9 years old, young Charles learned a cruel lesson about power and its burdens. His father died, and in the cold winter of 1380, the boy became King of France. 11 years old, not yet a teenager, and already the weight of a fractured kingdom rested fully upon his small, trembling shoulders. He was far too young to rule in truth, of course. So the power passed to his uncles, the ambitious and calculating Dukes of Burgundy-Berry and Anjou. These were not kindly guardians, but men driven by their own political desires. They tightened their grip on the treasury, enriched themselves at the expense of the people, and sowed the early seeds of civil war that would later tear France apart. And what of Charles, during these turbulent years, isolated within the gilded walls of his palaces? His every moment scripted by ceremony and duty, he was like a delicate flower forced to bloom in a stone courtyard. His days were long lessons in diplomacy and warfare. His nights lonely vigils beneath heavy velvet canopies, wondering when, if ever, he would truly be free. Loneliness does strange things to a young mind. It shapes thoughts into strange patterns, weaves worry into every silent moment. And for Charles, there was little escape. He was surrounded by adults who saw him not as a child, but as a symbol, a tool, a pawn to be maneuvered across the great chessboard of European politics. Without the warmth of genuine affection, or the freedom to play and imagine as children should, Charles retreated inward. In those long, echoing halls, he found company not in friends, but in the strange stories his mind began to craft. And perhaps in those quiet moments, the first fragile cracks in his reality began to form. When he was just 14, his uncles arranged a grand marriage to Isabeau of Bavaria, a political union meant to secure alliances and quiet dissent. Isabeau, barely a year older than Charles, was as much a victim of these machinations as he was. They were two children thrust into the gilded cage of monarchy, expected to behave as sovereign rulers, while their hearts still longed for simple joy. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp and lavish feasts, but behind the jeweled curtains and flowing wine, Charles's mind remained restless. Already there were whispers. The young king was prone to sudden outbursts of temper, moments of unsettling silence followed by fits of unexplained melancholy. He would disappear into his chambers for days at a time, emerging pale and withdrawn, as if battling storms no one else could see. Historians might call this the early onset of what would later be termed the glass delusion, but in those days it had no name. His courtiers simply called it a heaviness of the spirit, and they did what royal courts have always done: they looked the other way and hoped it would pass. But madness once planted is a seed that does not die easily. It grows in the quiet, fed by fear, nurtured by isolation. And so it was with Charles. Every passing year brought new burdens, wars to fight, rebellions to quash, a kingdom to rule. And every year his mind grew a little more fragile, a little more convinced that the weight of it all might quite literally shatter him. By the time he reached his mid-20s, the seeds of that early madness had blossomed fully. He was known to wander the palace corridors at night, speaking to unseen companions, his hands carefully held away from his sides, as if terrified of touching the cold stone walls. He wore thickly padded clothing, even in the summer heat, convinced it would protect his glass body from breaking. And yet, through it all, there was still a flicker of the boy he once was. A boy who had never been allowed to run freely through the fields, never known the simple joy of childish laughter. That boy remained trapped somewhere deep inside the man, fragile, frightened, and utterly alone. As you lie there now, eyes heavy, listening to the soft rhythm of your own breath, imagine that boy, sitting quietly on the cold marble floor of his chamber, his back against the wall, knees drawn close, whispering into the stillness, "I am made of glass. Be careful. Please, be careful." And with that, we close this chapter of his youth, a life shaped not by freedom, but by the unrelenting weight of a crown placed far too soon upon his fragile head. Rest easy, dear listener. The story continues, but for now let your thoughts drift gently, just as young Charles once did, into the quiet corners of his mind, away from the heavy burdens of the waking world. The human mind is a curious vessel. Like the finest glass, it can reflect beauty and brilliance, but under too much pressure, it cracks. And sometimes, when the break finally comes, it is both sudden and spectacular, like a mirror shattering under a single blow. For King Charles dies, that terrible breaking point arrived on a cold January night in 1393 at what should have been a celebration, a glittering event meant to lift spirits and chase away the dark shadows of a long winter. It was called the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, a masquerade unlike any other. A grand hall was prepared, draped in heavy silks, and illuminated by hundreds of flickering candles. Music drifted through the air, soft, haunting melodies from distant corners of the chamber, while the scent of warmed wine spiced with cloves and cinnamon mingled with the perfume of fresh-cut flowers. This was not a night for politics or war. It was meant to be a moment of escape, a rare breath of joy for a court so often consumed by duty and despair. But hidden beneath the laughter and dancing fate was quietly winding the clock toward disaster. The theme of the evening was light-hearted mischief. Nobles were encouraged to dress in wild costumes, masks, and disguises that would blur rank and identity, if only for a few hours. And someone whose name history has long since forgotten proposed a performance, something daring and amusing to entertain the court. It would be called the Dance of the Wild Men, or the Dance of the Savages. 6 young men, including King Charles himself, would dress as wild forest creatures, clad in costumes made of linen soaked in resin and pitch, then covered with flammable flax to mimic matted hair. They would leap and whirl through the ballroom in a wild, raucous dance meant to resemble untamed men of the woods. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely unsuited to a room full of open flames. But in the haze of wine and merriment, no one thought to object. And so the king, already a man teetering on the fragile edge of his sanity, donned his flammable disguise and stepped into a circle of flickering candlelight. As the dance began, laughter filled the hall. The wild men leapt and spun their costumes, rustling and sparking faintly as they passed near the torches. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria and the gathered ladies of the court clapped politely, even as some shifted nervously, aware of just how dangerous the scene had become. And then, with the casual cruelty of fate, the inevitable happened. A torch held too close by the Duke of Orléans, Charles' own brother, caught the edge of one dancer's costume. In an instant, the flames leapt from one man to the next, devouring the resin-soaked linen like dry kindling. Panic erupted. The great hall filled with screams as fire roared to life amid the silks and banners. 4 of the dancers were engulfed almost instantly, their bodies consumed by the flames before they could even cry out for help. The air turned thick with smoke and the sharp, terrible scent of burning flesh. But amidst the chaos, a single moment of calm heroism emerged. One of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, quick-thinking and courageous, threw her heavy skirts around King Charles, smothering the flames before they could consume him. The king survived physically unharmed, but something deep within his mind did not. In the days that followed, the court fell into a strange, uneasy quiet. The charred remnants of the ballroom were hastily cleared away, the walls scrubbed clean of soot, but no one could erase what had happened. The echoes of that night remained hanging in the air like smoke that refused to lift. And King Charles, he changed. It was as if something had snapped in that moment of fire and terror. Where once he had suffered brief spells of melancholy and isolation, now came something far more terrifying, complete and overwhelming breaks from reality. Just weeks after the Bal des Ardents, the first full episode of madness descended upon him. It began with a simple journey. The king was riding through the forests near Le Mans. Accompanied by his retinue, the sun dappled through the trees and the winter air crisp and clean. Without warning, Charles drew his sword and turned on his own men. With wild eyes and a voice trembling with confusion and rage, he shouted, "Traitors, you seek my life!" And then he attacked. He struck down his own companions, slashing wildly, his mind lost to visions that only he could see. His loyal guards, horrified and unprepared, struggled to subdue him without harming their king. It took several men to wrestle the sword from his hands and bring him safely, though not calmly, back to his chambers. For days after Charles drifted through a fog of delusion, he did not recognize his wife. He did not know his own children. At times, he would sit in silence for hours, staring at his reflection in a silver mirror, touching his face, as if unsure it belonged to him. At other times, he would wander the palace corridors, muttering about invisible enemies and unseen dangers. And then came the most famous and heartbreaking delusion of all. Charles became utterly convinced that his body was made of glass. He feared even the slightest touch might shatter him into 1,000 fragile pieces. He ordered that his clothing be reinforced with thick layers of fabric and specially padded to protect his supposedly delicate frame. He walked carefully, cautiously, as if one wrong step might send cracks spider-webbing through his bone. No one was allowed to touch him. Even his doctors, desperate to treat the king's madness with the limited knowledge of their time, could not approach him without his fearful permission. And so the halls of the palace grew quiet once more, but now it was a silence born not of loneliness, but of fear. Fear that the king, the man who held the fate of France in his trembling hands, had lost himself completely to the dark recesses of his mind. France, a kingdom already fragile from years of war and political unrest, now faced the most unsettling crisis of all, a ruler who could no longer rule a mind that had become a fragile glass prison from which there was no escape. And as you lie there drifting towards sleep, imagine the king's footsteps echoing faintly down the long stone corridors. Each step carefully placed his padded robes swishing gently against the floor, his hands held out before him, afraid of the world, afraid of himself, and forever convinced that beneath the flesh and blood, he was nothing more than glass. Sleep now, listener. The night is long, but the story continues. And in the next chapter, we will explore how a kingdom tried to carry on with a king forever on the edge of breaking. History is filled with grand battles, heroic speeches, and thunderous moments where the fate of nations was decided by the clash of swords or the stroke of a quill. But sometimes, history drifts through the quiet spaces between those moments, in hushed corridors, behind silk curtains, in the low murmur of conspirators, and the silent resignation of those too exhausted to fight. At the center of this silence, a fragile king sat upon a throne he could barely comprehend. King Charles VI of France, once called Charles the Beloved, now known by a far more somber title, Charles the Mad. The Kingdom of France stood precariously on the edge of disaster. While the king paced carefully across padded chambers, terrified that his glass body might shatter the affairs of state ground onward, driven by men and women who understood that if the king could no longer rule, they must do it for him. And so began a strange era of governance, one where power moved through whispers rather than decrees, and the outward image of the monarchy was maintained with all the delicate care one might give to a priceless vase, beautiful, fragile, and always one careless moment away from destruction. Within the royal court, a dangerous game unfolded. The king's most trusted advisors and family members, each with their own ambitions, stepped carefully into the growing vacuum of power. Chief among them was the queen herself, Isabeau of Bavaria. Isabeau was a woman both admired and reviled by history. To some, she was a cunning and capable leader who did what was necessary to hold the kingdom together during her husband's decline. To others, she was a schemer, a woman who placed her own ambitions above the good of France. But whatever history decides, one fact remains undeniable. When the king withdrew from the world, Isabeau stepped forward. She took control of the court's daily operations, presiding over councils, managing royal finances, and making diplomatic decisions that would shape the fate of the realm. And yet, even as she worked tirelessly to hold the crumbling court together, she could not hold back the tidal wave of political rivalry that surged in the king's absence. Two powerful factions rose to dominance. The Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orléans, the king's ambitious brother, who believed that royal power should pass into his capable hands. The Burgundians, commanded by the Duke of Burgundy, who saw the king's madness as an opportunity to extend his influence over the crown. They were not content to simply govern in peace. They played a brutal game of political chess, maneuvering for control of key territories, forging secret alliances, and using the king's condition as both shield and weapon. Publicly, everyone maintained the fiction that King Charles was still in control. His royal seal was affixed to decrees he did not read. His presence was requested at events he could scarcely endure. In the grand halls of the Louvre and the Château de Vincennes, the court went about its business as if nothing had changed. The tapestries were dusted. The music played. The golden fleur-de-lis banners hung proudly from the wall. But behind every forced smile, behind every elaborate mask, worn during the endless series of balls and banquets, there was one silent, unavoidable truth. France had no king, at least not one who could stand before his people and lead them. During his clearer moments, Charles would appear in court, dressed in the finest silks, his robes heavily padded to protect his imagined glass body. He sat upon his throne with a distant gaze, his hands trembling faintly in his lap. Conversations swirled around him. Ambassadors delivered impassioned speeches. Nobles debated taxation and trade routes. And the king simply sat in silence, occasionally reaching out to touch the golden arms of his throne, as if testing to see if they too were made of fragile glass. When the episodes of madness returned, he would disappear again for days, sometimes weeks, locked away in his chambers. During these periods, the court moved as if through fog, uncertain, directionless, and always aware that at any moment some new calamity could strike. The people of France, too, felt the absence of their king. Rumors spread like wildfire through the cobbled streets of Paris and beyond. Some whispered that the king had died long ago, and that an impostor sat upon the throne. Others claimed that the queen had poisoned him, that dark sorcery kept him locked away in a tower. In truth, the reality was far sadder. He was alive, but he was lost. Sometimes he wandered the palace gardens alone at night, his footsteps muffled by the thick grass. Guards would watch him from a distance, not daring to approach as he knelt before fountains or pressed his trembling fingers against the cold marble statues. Perhaps he found some comfort there among things as unmoving and fragile as he believed himself to be. And while the king wandered, the struggle for power intensified. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions plunged the country into bitter civil strife. Blood was spilled not on foreign fields, but on the very streets of Paris. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Noble families armed their private militias. The great city of light grew dim under the weight of violence and uncertainty. Yet still the fiction of stability endured. The royal court continued to host glittering festivals. Musicians played their lutes and viols. Dancers spun across polished stone floors under the glow of chandeliers. Because to admit the truth that the throne was empty, even as the king sat upon it, was too dangerous, too destabilizing. And so they pretended. France in those years became a kingdom of performance, a kingdom that kept dancing, even as the floor beneath it cracked. And through it all, Charles remained, a ghost in his own palace, a king locked within a fragile prison of his own mind, untouched by the wars waged in his name, unaware or perhaps painfully aware that the world he was meant to rule had moved on without him. Sleep now, dear listener. The fires of political ambition still burn in the dark, but their flickering light cannot disturb your rest. In our next chapter, we will walk alongside the wandering king through the moonlit gardens and silent hallways, and discover how one man lived each day, convinced that a single misstep might break him forever. The night air around the royal palace was often still heavy with the scent of old stone, damp earth, and fading roses from the sprawling gardens. And through this stillness, a figure would sometimes wander, alone, barefoot, his footsteps light, as if every inch of ground might shatter beneath him. This was King Charles VI of France, no longer the youthful, hopeful monarch he had once been. His face was gaunt now, his once brilliant blue eyes clouded by the weight of unseen terror. But above all else, he carried one belief, one fragile, haunting conviction. He was made of glass, not just figuratively, not as a poetic reflection of a broken mind. No, in his world, in the halls of his troubled mind, his very bones, his skin, even his heart, were crafted from the most delicate, transparent crystal. And if he moved too suddenly, if he stumbled or fell, he would shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. This strange delusion, known to historians as the glass delusion, was rare but not unheard of among Europe's nobility during the late medieval period. Yet none embodied it so completely, so heartbreakingly as Charles VI. His daily life became a performance of survival, an endless, careful ballet of cautious steps and padded protection. Tailors were ordered to line his royal garments with thick layers of cloth and soft cushioning. His robes, once flowing and majestic, became heavy with hidden padding. His chairs were padded as well, and even the throne itself was covered in silken cushions to prevent any hard contact with his imagined fragile form. In his private chambers, rugs were laid thick upon the stone floors. Servants were instructed to remove any sharp or hard-edged objects. Mirrors, ironically, were covered or removed, lest he glimpse his own reflection and feel the terror of imagining it shattering before his eye. Walking became a ritual of extreme caution. Charles would glide through the palace corridors with slow, deliberate steps, his hands sometimes outstretched before him, as if feeling for invisible barriers. And always he was careful to avoid sudden movements. Even the sound of raised voices nearby could send him into a state of trembling fear. He would clutch at his chest, eyes wide, whispering to himself, afraid that the vibrations of anger might fracture the delicate shell he believed himself to be trapped within. There were moments when his mind would clear, if only briefly. In those rare windows of lucidity, the crushing weight of reality would bear down on him. He would remember his wife, Queen Isabeau, his children, his shattered kingdom. And in the darkest of those moments, he would sob quietly in the gardens, surrounded by marble statues and silent stone fountains, mourning a life he could no longer live. For the court, these episodes were both a tragedy and an inconvenience. When Charles wandered like this, the royal physicians would often trail behind at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves about the king's condition and how best to manage his next inevitable collapse. They applied leeches and herbal tonics. They prayed and performed ancient rituals. But nothing could pierce the crystalline prison of the king's mind. In public ceremonies, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the illusion that all was well. When he appeared before the court, his heavy robes and padded clothing made him appear larger, more cumbersome. His slow, halting steps across the grand marble halls seemed less regal and more like a man balancing on a knife's edge. And sometimes he would simply stop frozen in place, refusing to take another step, for fear that his delicate form might crack under the strain. Attendants would rush to his side, coaxing him forward with soft voices and patient hands. "Your Majesty, you are safe. You will not break." But even the most soothing words could not undo the powerful grip of his belief. He lived each day in quiet terror. At times, he refused to be touched at all. His children, confused and heartbroken, could only watch from a distance as their father, the King of France, moved through his life like a man trapped in the center of a great glass sculpture, untouched and untouchable. Historians often debate why this delusion took such a powerful hold of Charles's mind. Some believe it was the immense pressure of kingship during a time of endless war and internal strife. Others suggest it was hereditary madness, a cruel legacy passed down through royal bloodlines, already thinned by generations of political marriages and inbreeding. But perhaps it was simply the final refuge of a man who had seen too much pain and could no longer face a world made entirely of sharp edges and hard realities. Better perhaps to imagine oneself as fragile glass than to feel the full weight of a shattered kingdom upon one's shoulders. And yet through all this, Charles VI remained king. He still wore the crown. He still sat upon the throne. Even if his mind had long since abdicated those responsibilities, his body, fragile as he believed it to be, remained the symbol of royal authority. And so the kingdom continued moving like a grand and tragic theater, where every actor played their part, and the central figure remained locked behind an invisible pane of delicate crystal. As you drift deeper into rest, picture those silent palace corridors, the flicker of candlelight reflecting faintly off golden walls, the slow, careful footsteps of a king who believed every breath, every heartbeat was a risk. And outside those great stone walls, the world raged on, wars were fought, alliances were broken, and the fate of France hung by a thread. But within that fragile world of glass, there was only silence, and the haunting echo of careful footsteps on padded floors. Sleep well now, dear listener. When next we meet, we will explore the sorrowful roles played by Queen Isabeau and those who loved and sometimes used the fragile king. In the grand halls of the French court, where whispers could weigh as heavily as swords and glances held the sharpness of daggers, one figure stood quietly at the center of it all. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She was not born to this life of endless political storms and personal heartbreak, and yet by fate or misfortune, she became the steady presence in a kingdom ruled by a man who no longer ruled himself. At just 15 years old, Isabeau arrived in France a foreign princess with hopeful eyes and a heart still open to the promise of love. Her marriage to King Charles VI was to be a bond of peace and alliance, a union that would strengthen two great houses and stabilize a fragile realm. And for a time, it did. The young king had adored her. Their early years together were filled with promise, the glittering ceremonies of court life, and the soft joys of a growing family. But like so many fairy tales written in gilded ink, the ending was not to be a happy one. By the time she was just 23, Isabeau had watched the man she married. The man who once laughed freely and held her hand with confidence descend into the delicate madness of his own fragile mind. And suddenly the weight of France seemed to settle squarely on her slender shoulders. It was a heavy burden for anyone to bear, but for a young queen surrounded by scheming lords and hungry factions, it was a mantle forged in both sorrow and steel. Each day brought a delicate balancing act. On one side, there was her loyalty to her husband, to the crown, and to the ideal of a France united under one king. On the other, there was raw, undeniable power, the chance to influence the future of the realm, while the true king drifted further and further into his unreachable world of glass. Behind the towering cathedral walls and within the echoing marble chambers, the question was always the same. Would the queen rule in his place? Or merely stand as a figurehead while others seized control? It was a dangerous question, and one without a simple answer. Isabeau knew that any overt display of authority might provoke the powerful dukes who circled the throne like wolves, waiting for their moment to take control of the regency, the treasury, and, ultimately, the kingdom itself. The Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Orléans. Each man held his own vision for France, and neither cared much for the idea of a young woman standing in their way. So Isabeau learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court life with grace and cunning. She became a master of diplomacy, a quiet force behind veiled words and carefully chosen silences. She attended council meetings where the king sat vacant-eyed, his mind wandering to fragile worries of breaking bones and shattering skin. And when decisions had to be made, it was Isabeau who gently guided the conversation, her words falling like soft raindrops, never forceful, yet shaping the flow of power nonetheless. But with power came scandal. Whispers began to circulate through the shadowed corridors that the queen was too ambitious, that she had grown too close to certain members of the court, that in the absence of a king's mind, she had found comfort in the arms of other men. The name most often linked with hers was Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's own brother. It was said that Louis held late-night audiences with the queen, that their conversations grew too personal, their alliance too intimate. Did she love him, or was it merely another political necessity, another act in the long, exhausting play of survival? History remains uncertain, but the rumors never stopped. And all the while, Charles VI remained locked in his silent torment, lost to a world where his own children could not embrace him without fear of breaking his imagined glass form. For Isabeau, the loneliness was profound. She moved through the grand halls of the Louvre and the Hôtel Saint-Paul, her eyes constantly measuring the moods of the nobles, her heart forever balancing between grief for her lost husband and the harsh reality that she was, for all intents and purposes, ruling a kingdom through whispers and sighs. There were nights when she stood alone at the high windows, looking out over the darkened city of Paris. The Seine River glimmered faintly under the pale moonlight, and in the distance, church bells marked the hours of yet another sleepless night. Did she wonder then how history would remember her? Would she be called a loyal queen or a dangerous temptress, a devoted wife or a cold-hearted regent? The truth, as is so often the case, lived somewhere in the quiet spaces between. She had loved a man who could no longer be reached. She had borne the children of a king who no longer remembered their names. And through it all, she carried the weight of a nation, its wars, its debts, its endless, bitter conflicts. Perhaps she made mistakes. Perhaps she reached for power when she should have held back. But in a world where a woman's choices were so often defined by the actions of men, Isabeau chose something different. She chose survival. And in the fragile kingdom of France, where the king himself believed he might shatter with a single touch, survival was perhaps the most powerful act of all. So as you settle deeper into rest, imagine her now, standing quietly in a long corridor lined with stained glass windows. The colored light dances softly across the stone floors. Outside, the city hums with life. But inside these sacred walls, the queen stands still, alone but unbroken. And even as history casts its long, judgmental shadow over her name, she remains there, a figure of silent strength in a kingdom made entirely of glass. Sleep well now, dear listener. When next we meet, we'll step back into the storm, into the bitter feuds that would soon plunge France into chaos, and into the tragic saga known as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. The great stone walls of Paris had seen many storms, but none quite like this. Outside, the winds of winter howled through the crooked alleyways and across the icy waters of the Seine. But inside the royal court, a colder and far more dangerous storm was gathering, one built not of snow and rain, but of pride, ambition, and blood. France was a kingdom without a king, at least a king in mind and spirit. Charles VI, once the hopeful monarch crowned in glittering ceremony, had now faded into a tragic figure. His mind brittle as the glass he believed his body to be, wandered the silent halls of the Hotel Saint-Paul, lost in imagined dangers and forgotten names. And where there is no king, others rise to seize the throne of influence. The struggle for power began quietly like the first faint cracks in a frozen river. But soon those cracks deepened, loud, violent, and unstoppable. On one side stood Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's younger brother. Brilliant, charming, and dangerously ambitious Louis had long enjoyed the privileges of proximity to the throne. With the king incapable of ruling, it was Louis who signed royal decrees, controlled state finances, and if the whispers were true, shared a bond far too close with Queen Isabeau herself. He wore silks as easily as armor spoke poetry, as fluently as military strategy, and understood that in a court full of brittle egos and fragile alliances, the sharpest weapon was not the sword, but the tongue. Opposing him was John the fearless Duke of Burgundy. Where Louis was light and wit, John was steel and shadow, son of the formidable Philip the Bold. John inherited not only vast lands and wealth, but also his father's fierce belief that the Burgundian house had a divine right to shape France's destiny. He was not a man given to flowery speeches or idle gestures. He was blunt, decisive, and utterly relentless. And he viewed Louis with the kind of cold disdain reserved for traitors and usurpers. For years, their rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Every council meeting was a battlefield. Every policy, a skirmish. Louis favored high taxes to support lavish royal spending and foreign adventures. John the pragmatist pushed for economic restraint and closer ties to England to end the crippling 100 Years' War. And all the while, the French people suffered. Famine stalked the countryside. The treasury lay empty save for echoes and broken promises. Peasant revolts flared like sparks in a dry field. And still, the dukes schemed. But like all storms, this one would not stay contained forever. On a frigid evening in November 1407, as the mists curled low over the cobbled streets of Paris, the bitter feud turned deadly. Louis of Orléans, confident in his untouchable status, left the Queen's apartments late that night. He rode through the winding streets under torchlight. His guards relaxed his mind, perhaps already wandering to the comforts of home. They never saw the ambush coming. In the narrow Rue Vieille du Temple, shadows detached themselves from the alley walls. John the Fearless had made his move. Armed men, some say as many as 15, fell upon Louis's entourage with brutal efficiency. Before his guards could raise a defense, Louis was dragged from his horse and cut down in the street. His body was left there, blood pooling across the frozen cobblestones, a final exclamation mark to a feud that had simmered for far too long. The king's brother was dead, and France trembled. The murder was bold, almost unthinkable. And yet John the Fearless did not hide. In fact, within days, he publicly admitted his role. His reasoning, he claimed it was a tyrannicide, a noble act to rid the kingdom of a dangerous, corrupting influence. And for a time, many believed him. John's supporters hailed him as a patriot. The University of Paris itself, a powerful voice of intellectual authority, issued a statement justifying the act. But if John thought this brutal act would end the struggle, he was sorely mistaken. Instead, it lit the fires of a civil war that would burn across France for decades. The court split into two bitter factions, the Burgundians led by John the Fearless, and the Armagnacs led by the Count of Armagnac, who now stood as the protector of the late Duke of Orléans' legacy and his children. France became a nation divided. Cities raised banners not in loyalty to a king, but to rival dukes. Family turned against family. Old alliances crumbled, and all the while King Charles VI wandered his silent palaces, speaking to phantoms and fearing the invisible cracks he imagined running through his own fragile bones. The streets of Paris turned dangerous. Assassinations became common. Armagnac and Burgundian militias clashed openly, their battles turning public squares into slaughterhouses. And behind every closed door, behind every curtain in the grand halls, whispered plots continued. Even Queen Isabeau, weary and worn by the endless games of power, found herself drawn into the web, sometimes siding with the Burgundians, at other times with the Armagnacs. Her loyalty, like the kingdom itself, fractured and uncertain. Through it all, the people of France could only watch in despair. Their king was alive, but his mind was lost. Their leaders were men of ambition, not mercy. And with every passing year, the kingdom drew closer to the brink. By the dawn of the 15th century's second decade, the great nation of France, once the jewel of Christendom, stood at the very edge of ruin. A kingdom with a king who could not rule. A queen caught between duty and survival, and a people left to suffer under the crushing weight of civil war. But even darker days were yet to come. As the civil strife tore France apart, a foreign power watched and waited across the narrow sea. England, led by a ruthless and brilliant young king, Henry V. England was ready to strike. And in the chaos of France's broken crown, he saw his perfect opportunity. But that, dear listener, that is a story for another night. For now, rest. Let the echoes of history fade into the quiet hum of sleep. And when you return, we'll step back into the storm as France faces the shattering blow of the Battle of Agincourt. And the madness of a glass king becomes the catalyst for one of history's most famous and tragic wars. Sleep well as the bitter winter winds howled across the fractured kingdom of France far to the north. Another ruler sat in cold contemplation. But unlike the fragile king, Charles the Célèbre, lost within his mind of imagined glass, this king's thoughts were sharp, his will unbreakable. He was young, he was hungry, and he was about to change the course of history. His name was Henry III of England. At just 26 years old, Henry had already tasted the brutal edge of war and the cruel bite of politics. Crowned in 1413, his short reign had thus far been marked by a singular burning ambition to claim the French crown for himself. You see, Henry believed it wasn't just a political aspiration. It was his birthright. Through his ancestor, Edward III, the English Plantagenet line had long laid claim to the French throne. And while the flames of the 100 Years' War had smoldered for decades, Henry saw France's current turmoil as the perfect moment to reignite the blaze. And what a perfect storm it was! France, under the broken rule of Charles VI, was leaderless in all but name. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria had retreated into her own intricate web of survival, playing the Burgundian and Armagnac factions against each other like a desperate gambler hedging her final bets. The Royal Council had become a battlefield of quarreling nobles, and the streets of Paris were stained with the blood of civil strife. Henry watched and waited. Then, like a hawk striking a wounded hare, he made his move. In 1415, Henry gathered his forces for what would become one of the most legendary military campaigns in history. His aim, not just conquest, total humiliation of France. With banners raised and war drums pounding, his fleet set sail across the English Channel, landing on French soil with a force of about 12,000 men. Small by the standards of continental armies, but Henry wasn't concerned with numbers. He had something far more deadly, a weapon that had turned the tide of battles before and would do so again: the English longbow. Light, fast, and terrifyingly effective, the longbow transformed simple archers into harbingers of death. A trained archer could release up to 12 arrows per minute, each capable of piercing armor from over 250 yards away. It wasn't just weaponry, it was psychological warfare. And so the campaign began. Henry's initial goal was to march his army through France to the safety of English-held Calais, demonstrating his right to move through French lands unchallenged. But the French nobles, still arguing amongst themselves, but unwilling to see their lands so brazenly trampled, rallied a force of over 20,000 men to intercept him. The confrontation took place near a small muddy field between two forests, a place called Agincourt, October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The ground was soaked with days of rain. Heavy clay turned the battlefield into a quagmire. French knights in their gleaming armor mounted their magnificent war horses and prepared for what should have been an easy, crushing victory over the exhausted English invaders. But what they didn't account for was the mud and the long bows. Henry's army took position behind sharpened stakes planted in the ground to repel cavalry. His archers, spread out in a deadly formation, waited silently as the French forces advanced. Then, with a signal, the sky turned dark. Thousands upon thousands of arrows rained down, whistling death through the misty air. The French cavalry charged and bogged down almost immediately in the thick mud. Their horses flailed and collapsed. Their knights, weighed down by over 60 pounds of steel, slipped and stumbled, becoming easy targets for the relentless hail of arrows. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. When it was over, the French nobility lay shattered in the mud. Over 7,000 French soldiers and nobles were dead. The English, they lost barely 400 men. Henry stood victorious not just over a battlefield, but over the very soul of France. This stunning victory didn't just win him glory. It earned him something far more valuable leverage. With France so divided and demoralized, Henry forced the French crown to the negotiating table. In 1420, the infamous Treaty of Troy was signed, and with it, Henry secured a political victory as great as any he had achieved in war. By the terms of the treaty, Henry would marry Charles IX's daughter, Catherine of Valois. He would be recognized as heir and regent to the French throne. And upon Charles de Nassau's death, the crowns of England and France were to be united under Henry's rule. For a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed the House of Lancaster had finally achieved what generations before had only dreamed. England and France, united under a single king, but fate as always had its own plans. Though Henry had conquered the battlefield and even the French royal line through marriage, he could not conquer time. In 1422, just 2 years after the Treaty of Troyes, Henry IV fell ill. He died at the young age of 35, his dreams of a united empire fading with his final breath. Charles VI, the fragile glass king, followed him to the grave just 2 months later, and so the French throne, according to the treaty, should have passed to Henry's infant son, Henry VI of England. But France would not be claimed so easily. From the ashes of defeat, from the shattered remains of a divided kingdom, a new force began to rise. A force unlike any France had seen before. She wore no crown. She carried no banner of noble birth, but she carried something far more powerful: faith and a sword. Her name, Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. But that is a tale for another night, dear listener. One of visions and flames, of impossible victories and tragic endings. For now, close your eyes. Let the winds of history quiet. And when you return, we will walk beside the Maid of Orleans herself through the fires of destiny and the echoes of a nation's rebirth. Sleep well. The winter of 1429 was cruel in the French countryside. Fields lay barren villages, smoldered from years of conflict, and the once mighty kingdom of France seemed little more than a fading memory. The English controlled vast swaths of northern territory. Paris had fallen silent under foreign banners, and the rightful heir to the French throne, the Dauphin, Charles, languished in uncertainty, paralyzed by doubt and political paralysis. The French people, they had almost forgotten how to hope. But hope, like a single flickering candle in the dark, has a strange way of refusing to die. And from the humblest of places, it would rise again. Not from the marble halls of the Louvre, not from the seasoned generals hardened by years of battle, but from a thatched roof cottage in the obscure village of Domremy, near the borderlands of Lorraine, from a teenage peasant girl who could neither read nor write. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, but you may know her as Joan of Arc, the girl who would go toe-to-toe with kings, challenge the greatest military powers of her day, and etch her name in history with nothing more than a sword, and a voice she claimed came from heaven itself. Joan was born in 1412, the daughter of Jacques d'Arc, a modest farmer, and Isabelle Romay. Her life, by all accounts, should have been painfully ordinary. She spent her days tending sheep, helping in the fields, and mending clothing by the dim glow of a hearth fire. But something stirred within Joan, something that didn't quite belong to the simple, predictable rhythms of peasant life. At just 13 years old, while standing alone in her father's garden, she heard a voice. Not a whisper of imagination, a clear, undeniable voice. She later described it as the voice of Saint Michael, leader of heaven's armies. And with that voice came a vision, a brilliant light, and a message that would alter not just her own fate, but the destiny of France itself. The message was simple, and yet impossibly heavy for a child to bear. Joan, you must drive the English out of France. You must bring the Dauphin to Reims and see him crowned king. At first she resisted. After all, she was just a girl. What could she possibly do? But the voices returned again and again. Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, holy figures commanding her to act, urging her to stand when all others had fallen. And so, against all reason, all logic, and all the weight of medieval society pressing down upon her, Joan made a decision. She would obey. She would lead France to victory. The road from Domremy to the royal court was not a straight one. Joan faced ridicule, suspicion, and rejection at every turn. Her own father threatened to drown her if she pursued this mad quest. Local officials dismissed her as nothing more than a foolish girl afflicted by wild dreams. But Joan was relentless. With fiery conviction, she traveled to the castle of Robert de Baudricourt, a local commander, and demanded an audience. At first, Baudricourt laughed her out of the hall. But as rumors of her visions spread, and as news of Joan's unwavering faith reached his ears, something shifted. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was the strange charisma that seemed to radiate from this illiterate farm girl. Whatever the reason, he finally agreed to send her to Chinon, where the Dauphin, Charles' future King Charles VII, was hiding in political limbo. It was a journey through war-torn lands and dangerous territories, but Joan arrived at Chinon with a singular purpose. She demanded to see the Dauphin, and when she stood before him dressed in simple men's clothing, her short hair tucked under a soldier's cap, she did something extraordinary. According to legend, Charles had hidden himself among his courtiers to test her divine claim. But Joan, without hesitation, walked directly through the gathered nobles and fell to her knees before him. "I am not here for the nobility," she said. "I am here for you, the true King of France." Charles, ever cautious and plagued by doubt, put Joan through rigorous questioning. He sent theologians and scholars to interrogate her claims of divine visions. But no matter the question, no matter the trap set before her, Joan's answers were simple, unwavering, and sincere. Finally desperate for any advantage in this seemingly hopeless war, Charles agreed. He gave her command of troops. He gave her a suit of custom-made armor forged in the shining image of a knight. And most remarkably of all, he gave her a sword said to have been found buried behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, just as Joan had described in one of her visions. This girl, barely 17 years old, was about to lead France's soldiers into battle, and her first target, Orléans, a city under siege, a symbol of French resistance about to fall. When Joan arrived at Orléans, the French commanders scoffed. She was a child, a girl. What could she know of war? But it wasn't her knowledge of tactics that mattered. It was her faith. She carried a white banner embroidered with lilies and the names of Jesus and Mary. She didn't lead from the rear. She marched at the front, fearlessly into the heart of battle. And as she did, something miraculous began to happen. The demoralized French soldiers, seeing this young woman, unshaken by the hail of arrows, untouched by fear, began to believe again. They believed in her visions. They believed in themselves. Within days, Joan had rallied the troops and launched a series of bold attacks on the English positions. On May 8, 1429, the siege of Orléans was lifted. France had won, not through superior numbers, not through cunning military strategy, but through the unbreakable will of a girl who believed utterly and completely that she was destined to save her people. And this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Joan would ride alongside the Dauphin as he made his way to Reims, fulfilling the second part of her divine mission. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another night. For now, rest easy, knowing that even in the darkest moments, even when kings lose their minds and armies crumble sometimes, all it takes is a single unwavering heart to turn the tides of history. Sleep well. The year was 1429, and against every political calculation, military reality, and the crushing weight of despair, a peasant girl had done the impossible. Joan of Arc, barely 17, had broken through the cynicism of princes, the cold logic of war councils, and the heavy skepticism of a nation long bled dry by conflict. Now, with a battered but believing army at her side, she turned her gaze to Reims, the sacred city where kings of France were crowned. For Charles VII, the Dauphin, who had for years languished in uncertainty, Joan's belief in his destiny was more than inspiring. It was transformational. He had worn the title of king in waiting, but not the crown. France had been a kingdom in limbo, its lands fractured, its people starving, and its enemies closing in like wolves. But this illiterate girl from Domremy had rekindled a fire he no longer believed he possessed. And so, under the golden haze of a July morning, they began the march. The road to Reims was not paved in certainty. The journey wound through territories still loyal to the English and the powerful Burgundians. Every step forward was a gamble, a dance on the knife's edge between triumph and disaster. Yet, as the royal army advanced, towns began to open their gates. People who had given up hope now lined the roads, weeping openly as they watched this miracle unfold before their eyes. The soldiers, hardened by years of hopeless campaigns, now marched with their heads held high. They were no longer just men in armor. They were witnesses to a legend being forged in real time. Wherever Joan rode, banners unfurled. Church bells rang not in fear of invading armies, but in joyous welcome. And still, the girl who had been a shepherdess just a year before remained humble. She rode not at the front of the procession in glory, but quietly beside her king, speaking softly, urging him forward, not just to Reims, but to his own forgotten courage. Reims itself was a prize and a symbol. It was the holy seat of French coronations, the place where the sacred oil preserved since the baptism of Clovis, the first king of France, awaited to anoint the next rightful ruler. But the city was under the control of forces loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, an ally of the English. Yet something astonishing happened. Instead of resisting, the city's leaders, inspired by the approaching tide of faith and destiny, opened the gates. There was no siege, no bloodshed, just a quiet collective decision that enough suffering had passed. Reims would return to the fold of France, and Charles would finally take his place as God's anointed king. The day of the coronation, July 17th, 1429, dawned under skies that seemed to glow with a light not of this world. The great cathedral of Rheims, battered by years of war, yet still standing proud, was filled with the scent of incense and the hushed murmurs of thousands who packed its halls. And there, before the altar, stood Charles VII, hesitant no longer. The ceremony unfolded with all its ancient grandeur. The sacred oil touched his forehead, the weight of the crown settled on his brow, and the people cried out, "Long live the King!" as if they were exhaling years of collective suffering in one unified breath. But perhaps the most unforgettable image was not that of the newly crowned king. It was of Joan herself, standing quietly to the side in her battered armor, tears streaming down her face. This was her victory, not for personal glory, but for a higher purpose. Her mission was almost complete. In that single extraordinary moment, history had shifted, not by the hands of generals or kings, but by the unwavering belief of a teenage girl who had dared to tell a broken world that miracles were still possible. And for France, that day at Rheims was more than a coronation. It was the beginning of healing a fractured nation's soul. The bells of Rheims had barely fallen silent before the winds of politics began to shift again. Victory is a fickle friend, and for Joan of Arc, the very triumph she had delivered became the shadow that would hasten her downfall. The newly crowned Charles VII, his confidence restored and his throne legitimized, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the presence of the girl who had made it all possible. Joan had no title, no noble blood, and no seat at the royal council. Yet she carried a moral authority that made even the most seasoned lords uneasy. Her visions had guided armies. Her simple faith had outshone royal ambitions. And now, with the crown secured, there were whispers, dangerous whispers, that the Maid of Orleans had served her purpose. But Joan wasn't finished. Not yet. In the months that followed the coronation, Joan pushed relentlessly for Charles to press the advantage. She urged him to march on Paris to drive the English from France entirely. But Charles, ever cautious, began to retreat once more into the comfortable inertia of diplomacy and delay. Without the full backing of the crown, Joan led a series of smaller military campaigns, each one more desperate than the last. Her star was fading among the nobles who once saw her as a living miracle. Now they saw only a dangerous reminder of their own complacency. And then, in the spring of 1430, the inevitable happened. During a campaign to liberate the Burgundian-held city of Compiègne, Joan was captured, betrayed not by a single hand, but by the quiet turning away of those who should have ridden to her rescue. The Duke of Burgundy, ever pragmatic, sold her to the English for a sum of 10,000 livres. For the first time since she had stepped onto the stage of history, Joan was utterly alone. Her trial was a spectacle designed to destroy not just the girl, but the symbol she had become. The English knew that as long as Joan lived, her legend would inspire resistance. They needed not just her death, but her disgrace. The ecclesiastical court convened in Rouen was a mockery of justice. Presided over by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a man more loyal to English gold than to God, it sought not truth, but a predetermined verdict. Joan stood before her accusers in chains, wearing not armor, but a simple gray tunic, her short hair a reminder of the battlefield. Over the course of endless interrogations, the learned men of the court tried to entrap her with theological puzzles and trick questions. Yet, despite her lack of formal education, Joan answered with clarity and courage that left even her enemies in awe. Do you know if you are in God's grace? They asked a question designed to doom her, no matter how she answered. If I am not, she said calmly, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there. It was a response worthy of a scholar, a saint, or both. But the outcome had been decided before the first question was asked. Joan was condemned for heresy, for the simple crime of claiming that God had spoken to her, that she had worn men's clothing to protect her modesty in prison, became a charge of cross-dressing a mortal sin in the twisted logic of her judges. And so on May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. At just 19 years old, she stood before the pyre, her face pale but unafraid. Witnesses would later say that as the flames rose, she cried out the name of Jesus again and again, her voice clear and unwavering until it was silenced forever. As the fire consumed her, even her executioners wept. An English soldier reportedly turned away from the flames and whispered, "We have burned a saint today." But if the English believed they had destroyed Joan's legend, they had gravely misunderstood the nature of faith and history. Within 25 years, the very church that had condemned her reversed its judgment. In 1456, a new trial declared her innocent of all charges, her name restored, her martyrdom recognized. Centuries later, in 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Her ashes had long scattered to the winds, but her story lived on. Not just as a tale of war or politics, but as the ultimate testament to the power of conviction, to the idea that even the humblest soul can change the course of history. Centuries have passed since the fragile footsteps of a king echoed through the marble halls of France, and since a young peasant girl stood defiant in the face of flames. Yet their stories remain etched not on stone walls or royal decrees, but in the fragile architecture of memory. History, after all, is not a quiet graveyard of forgotten names. It is a living, breathing entity that clings to its most unusual and tragic souls. And in the case of Charles VI, the Glass King, and Joan of Arc, the warrior saint, history did more than remember. It transformed them into symbols far greater than the lives they lived. The Glass King's final days. In the end, Charles II lived longer than anyone expected. A hollowed-out man imprisoned by his own mind. His reign, once filled with promise, became a slow, agonizing descent into irrelevance. While France tore itself apart in civil war, Charles wandered the silent corridors of the Louvre, convinced he might shatter if touched too harshly. Those who served him whispered stories of his episodes, how he refused to bathe, fearing his body would dissolve like delicate sugar in water, how he sometimes wore thick iron bands under his robes to protect his fragile glass bones. And yet France remained his burden until his death in 1422. His legacy, a kingdom left fractured and leaderless, easy prey for foreign conquerors and internal betrayal. But in the curious way that history works, Charles became more than just a failed king. To future generations, he was a metaphor, a symbol of what happens when power becomes too fragile, when the weight of a crown is too much for the human mind to bear. His glass delusion was not just a mental illness, it was a haunting parable about leadership cracked under pressure. Even today, psychologists study Charles IX's when discussing rare delusional disorders. His madness became a case study, his glass body a symbol for the fragile state of mind in times of overwhelming responsibility. And what of Joan? While the memory of Charles VI faded into the echo chambers of forgotten kings, Joan's story did precisely the opposite. The flames that consumed her body failed to extinguish her legend. Instead, they ignited it. Within just a few decades of her death, France began to recognize that the illiterate peasant girl they had allowed to burn had been their greatest hope. In 1456, under the orders of Charles VII, finally, the king in full authority, a retrial was held. This time, not to condemn her, but to clear her name. And they did. Her charges were overturned. Her character was restored. But more importantly, her story took on a life of its own. Joan of Arc became a beacon in the darkest moments of French history. During the religious wars of the 16th century, both Protestants and Catholics claimed her as a symbol of righteousness. In the chaos of the French Revolution, she stood as an emblem of the common people's power against tyranny. And in the darkest hours of the 20th century, when France lay under the shadow of Nazi occupation, her name was spoken in quiet defiance by the resistance. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. Her statue now stands in the hearts of French cities, her image immortalized in cathedrals and national monuments. She had lived only 19 years, but her legend stretched across centuries. 2 lives, 2 lessons. The Glass King and the Warrior Saint. One born into unimaginable privilege, but paralyzed by the weight of his crown. The other born into obscurity, yet driven by unshakable faith to change the fate of a nation. One believed himself made of fragile glass, and in the end, shattered his kingdom. The other believed herself an unbreakable instrument of God, and became a legend of iron will and courage. If history teaches us anything through these lives, it is that strength is not always found in the grand halls of power. Sometimes it emerges from the humblest of places, a village girl with no formal education, armed only with belief and an unshakable sense of purpose. And sometimes power without the strength to bear it becomes more dangerous than weakness. As night falls and the echoes of their stories settle, we are left with a haunting thought. Will we be remembered for the glass we feared we might break? Or for the fire we dared to walk through? Because in the end, the human spirit is always walking the line between fragility and resilience, between shattering and standing tall against the flames. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember, every great story lives on in the quiet moments waiting for someone to retell it. As the final echoes of history fade into the quiet night, we leave behind the fragile halls of a glass king and the unwavering footsteps of a warrior saint. Their stories, though centuries old, continue to drift gently through time like forgotten whispers on a midnight breeze. Perhaps in the stillness of your own thoughts you'll wonder how close we all stand to the edge of madness, and how even the smallest, most unexpected hearts can carry the weight of a kingdom. So now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the distant toll of cathedral bells lull you into rest. And remember, history isn't always carved in stone. Sometimes it's as delicate as glass and as fleeting as a dream. Good night, and may the echoes of old souls bring you peace.